From the Kennan Institute in Washington, D.C., welcome to Kennan X, a podcast on our never-ending quest to understand Russia, Ukraine, and the surrounding region. I'm your host, Jill Dougherty.
Russia hopes that if it can succeed in redrawing the map in Ukraine, that means that others will be emboldened to take on the US too, that they will be able to, over time, redraw the global security map.
Wars are expensive. Weapons and ammunition cost a lot of money, not to mention the cost of human lives. But there's a cheaper way to help win a war: propaganda and disinformation. And that's what we're going to talk about today. For inspiration, I picked up an old paperback I have from 1972. It's called The Deception Game by Ladislav Bittman, a Cold War spy for Czechoslovakia who defected to the United States in 1968. It's a classic in explaining the game of deception. In it, Bittman says, quote, Soviet bloc intelligence agencies distinguish three basic types of special operations: disinformation, propaganda, and influence operations. Influence operations, he says, are, quote, the most demanding type of special operations. And just recently, half a century after Bittman published his book, we have a graphic example of that: a secret Russian Foreign Ministry document that outlines an offensive information campaign against the West. Details come from our guest, journalist Catherine Belton. Catherine Belton, welcome. I am really glad to be talking to you after all of these years. Welcome, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to see you.
Great. You're the international investigative reporter for the Washington Post, reporting on Russia. And actually, I knew you in the old days, my old days, in Moscow, when you were the Moscow correspondent for the Financial Times. And then even before that, you were with the Moscow Times, Business Week, and Reuters. And then I, of course, don't have to mention that you wrote a really fantastic book that's called Putin's People. So congratulations on that. And I'm really glad to have this chance to talk with you.
Thanks. That's very kind of you. And it's always good to catch up after so many years.
Yes. And after so many things really haven't changed that much. But in any case, we'll explore that. So late April, I open the Washington Post and I see an article that says, secret Russian foreign policy document urges action to weaken the U.S. And I have to say, initially I wasn't surprised because after all, we know that Russia is trying to do this. But then I read in your article, you cite a secret foreign ministry document, which is a classified addendum to Russia's 2023 official and actually public foreign policy concept of the Russian Federation. And you said that it was provided to the Post by a European intelligence service. I want to get into that as well. But, you know, the tone of the public document is actually kind of mild. It's got the usual boilerplate. But I think that secret document really doesn't pull any punches. I'm quoting here. You say, the ministry calls for an offensive information campaign and other measures spanning the, quote, military, political, economic, trade, informational, psychological spheres against a coalition of unfriendly countries, which, of course, are led by the United States. And could we begin, which I think is really interesting, you say the outcome, or the document says, the outcome of Russia's war in Ukraine will, to a great degree, determine the outlines of the future world order. And that goes way beyond just a war in Ukraine. So can you tell me, what is this?
Yeah, that was almost the most interesting line in the document because, as you say, yes, it's not a surprise, essentially, that Russia is seeking to weaken the West. What was a surprise that this was outlined in black and white in a foreign ministry document, because generally they try to not have those kind of things down on paper because, yes, as you say, in the official foreign policy concept, they try to keep their language quite benign, saying that yes, we're being chased and hounded by anti-Russian Western coalition that has been pursuing an anti-Russia policy now for decades, but it also says we bear no ill intentions towards the West, and we hope that the West will soon recognize the wrongness of its course and admit the complicated multipolar world that we're now living in, where the US is no longer the sole dominating power. But yes, this line in the addendum, the secret addendum, really gives the game away. They're saying that the outcome of the war in Ukraine is going to determine the outlines of the future world order. And that's a very strong hint, more than a hint, that they expect this conflict in Ukraine, their invasion of Ukraine, to basically be a global game changer. That if they can get away with it, this means that they and other autocracies, their allies now in China, Iran, North Korea, and elsewhere, may also be able to get away with forcefully changing international borders, because Russia will have proven a point in Ukraine that it can break international law, and that the West won't have the wherewithal or be too feckless to stop it. And we were almost at that point just a week ago, when Congress was still sitting on its hands, not being able to provide Ukraine with adequate aid. And if that bill had not gone through, then we would have fast seen the front lines in Ukraine crumbling, and we wouldn't be able to do anything about this change in the international border, which would leave Russia and other autocracies emboldened to increasingly challenge the West and increasingly redraw the global security map and international borders.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying. And I mean, essentially, I guess what they're saying is it's a hybrid war. And we have some of the details of that. But let's start with number one. How does Russia conduct this war? And I would say their first objective is trying to undermine support for Ukraine. So how did you find out from this secret document how they do that?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the secret document, it isn't too long and it doesn't go into too many details, but we already know quite a lot about how they operate. We know for them, it's been very important to undermine Western support for Ukraine. It's almost as important as achieving victory in the military battlefield. In fact, it's almost the same, because if you sap the West's will to provide Ukraine with weaponry, it automatically guarantees victory on the battlefield, and it doesn't cost as many lives or as much equipment or as many dollars as fighting militarily does. So I guess their number one operation has been to win friends and influence people. It does that partly through social media campaigns. It doesn't have Russia Today or Sputnik anymore, at least in the Western world, where they have been banned as arms of Kremlin propaganda. But it does have very active social media campaigns where they're pumping out slogans, posts, thousands and thousands of them every single day, basically trying to promote the idea that America and Europe should take care of their own domestic problems, that their budgets don't stretch to helping out allies such as Ukraine, and why should they defend the global order? Wouldn't it be better to just look after your own people, make sure mouths are fed, and meanwhile Russia can do what it likes in the near abroad? The social media is just one element, but it wouldn't work if they weren't able to pump out this stuff many times a day and get it noticed. And if it's picked up by a politician or a public opinion leader, then it can go viral and it gets noticed. And I was talking to Clint Watts, who's the head of Microsoft's Threat Analysis Center, and really he had the best description of how and why it works. And he said basically it works in a strategic aggregate way. You have nearly a decade now of Russia promoting and elevating the views of politicians in the US and in Europe who espouse isolationist views, who suit Moscow's agenda. And Russia is able to promote and elevate them and also provide them with ideas and content which they can then use to face down their opponents and scream outlet them for funding allies such as Ukraine, supposedly at the cost of their own countrymen's pockets.
In fact, there's a lot of discussion about that right now. I mean, it seems like a circular loop sometimes. I'm not quite sure even where it starts. You have politicians in the United States who usually are on the far right, and they are saying things that sound remarkably like what the Russians are saying. And then the Russians are quoting them, and then that swirls back to the United States, and there's constant amplification. It's really quite malign, I would say.
Yes, as Clint Watts from Microsoft also put it, this could never have happened 14 or so years ago before the onset of digital media, because those type of ideas, the idea that Ukraine wasn't important enough to be supported, that perhaps the US shouldn't support NATO, those type of ideas actually wouldn't have really gained traction in the mainstream media. But when you have this free-for-all on social media, especially for instance, in the far right wing of the Republican Party, those who shout loudest very often get the most grassroots donations. They're always coming out with extreme views, and it feeds in on itself. Like Russia perhaps sometimes can provide them with lines that are provocative, which elevates their status and standing. And that suits them and it suits Russia. But yes, it's difficult to write because it's what comes first. It's like a chicken and egg situation. But it's certainly mutually beneficial for some of the far-right politicians and for Russia, and they found this natural marriage.
Could I ask you, when you say they almost write their lines, which is really fascinating, in what way do you mean that they almost write their lines?
Well, unfortunately, the documents, so apart from this secret foreign ministry addendum, we also had access to internal Kremlin documents in which you can see the Kremlin discussing and instructing political strategists working for the Kremlin to amplify and promote certain ideas and posts, such as promoting American isolationism, promoting the views of the far-right Republican Party, promoting the idea that the US should protect its own border over those outside its border, and forgetting about the idea that a lot of the US's economic power and might has really come from it being a defender of the global free trade and the global order, and that this has made the dollar the reserve currency of the world, and that Americans have benefited to a great degree from this, its role as the global policeman, to sort of ditch all of that by the wayside. But we didn't see in the documents any instructions from the Kremlin or the political strategists to the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene or to Matt Gaetz, some of these people who seem to parrot the Kremlin talking points. But what we did see, there was one proposal in which Matt Gaetz was quoted in 2022, sort of immediately criticizing the initial $40 billion aid package for Ukraine and saying, why are we giving all these billions to Ukraine when Americans can't even afford baby formula? So, I mean, they're promoting this as the type of idea what we want to promote. But I'm afraid that what we've seen so far in the documents, it's only a tiny piece of the puzzle. We don't know how this happens, but we only know, for instance, you've had the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael McCall, saying that it seems to him that Russian propaganda has infected a large chunk of the GOP party base. You've had the head of the House Intelligence Committee saying that certainly seems to be true. And almost every time Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, opens her mouth, it seems like it's been written in the Kremlin, but we don't have the proof or know how or even if that has happened. But it seems there is somehow a natural marriage of ideas. Either she feels that she can raise her standing by being the loudest woman in the room and shouting, and that somehow these Kremlin ideas benefit her, because yes, she could argue that I'm defending Americans. Why are we spending all this money helping Ukraine when we should be feeding our own mouths? And it's a very effective and populist strategy.
I think it really would be fascinating to try to map that out, to see
Hmm.
how those messages and that strategic communications by the Kremlin actually get spread around. But there's another point that you make in that article that I think is really also disturbing. I would call it number 2 goal, which is shifting the current balance of power to refashion geopolitics, drawing closer to China, Iran, and North Korea. Okay, so I can see the importance of China and Iran, but walk me through why North Korea?
Yeah, it seems, I mean, basically, if you're the Kremlin and your main goal is to now make things difficult for the West, and it's to weaken the West's positions globally, then unfortunately, yes, you're going to cooperate with North Korea because you can make things tricky. It's what the Russians call an asymmetric response. A senior academic with ties to very senior foreign ministry officials told me that at the beginning of the war, when the US began supplying weapons to Ukraine, he said, I told my US colleagues, surely you don't expect that we're not going to have an asymmetric response to this, that we are going to make things tricky for you. And he said the first sign you can see that we're doing this is precisely in our growing relationship with North Korea and the fact that we vetoed a continuation of the UN's monitoring program over its development of its nuclear and ballistic missile program. So it's making things that had once seemed stable. There was 14 years of cooperation between Russia and the US on this program. Now it no longer exists, which creates more threats for the US worldwide. And you could argue that North Korea is closer to Russia, so obviously Russia is probably creating a threat for itself closer to its border, but that pales in comparison to Putin's more immediate objective, and that is making things very difficult, very tricky for the West in a whole host of areas. And also for him, cooperation with North Korea has become paramount because it's now providing him with ammunition because his own industry isn't able to make up for the shortfall. So his overriding objectives in redrawing the global order has overrode what had been much saner policies previously. And this Russian academic said that his Western colleagues had said, we don't believe you're going to have these asymmetric responses because, of course, it's going to blow back in your face too. But unfortunately, Russia seems to have let those niceties fall by the wayside and is more acting as a global spoiler. It wants to make things tricky and hot for the US in many different regions of the world. And we saw as well in some of the proposals and one of the documents we saw, another Russian academic was very often called on by the foreign ministry for policy suggestions and so on. This Russian academic, Vladimir Zharikhin, was proposing that Russia act to destabilize things for the US in many different parts of the world. He was saying that we should destabilize the situation in Latin America. We should escalate the situation in the Middle East surrounding Israel, Syria, and Iran. And this was long before the October 7th attacks of last year. He was making this proposal in February the 7th, and we've seen Russia draw ever closer to Hamas and to Iran over the last year too. As other Russian academics like to boast, there are many tricks that Russia has up its sleeve to make things difficult for the US globally. And again, going back to this redrawing of the world order, I mean, Russia hopes that if it can succeed in redrawing the map in Ukraine, that means that others will be emboldened to take on the US too, that they will be able to, over time, redraw the global security map. And we've heard Putin now several times in speeches over the last year or so saying for him, victory in Ukraine would actually constitute the West allowing him to once again have a sphere of interests in Eastern Europe, i.e. going back to the pre-post-Cold War order.
Yes, this is, dare I say, disturbing because, as you pointed out, Short term, it looks good for Russia because they can create problems. Long term, it begins to pull apart the
Mm.
structure, an international structure. But
Hmm.
it would appear that Putin, and I guess we have to jump into his mind to try to figure out why he's doing this, but it feels that his objective right now is to undermine the West and especially the United States, because he would argue they're doing the same thing to him,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm concerned, and I'd be interested in your viewpoint because you were in Russia for a very long time. Where do you think Putin is going with this? He's a relatively smart person, but right now he seems consumed with one idea, and that's Ukraine and then undermining the West. Where do you think he's going with this?
I think he has an end game in mind, and it's not total global destruction and destabilization, but I think he hopes that things will be tricky enough for the West, for the US, that they will take their eye off the ball, decide that continuing to assist Ukraine is just too much trouble. They've got too many global fires to put out, just as we've seen in Israel, and that there will be a change of leadership ultimately in the West, and the West will go back to business as usual, or even better than business as usual with Russia, and there will be a new alliance. I've spoken to one of his allies in France who had previously arranged loans from the Kremlin to Marine Le Pen's party in 2014, and he was very much advocating this line that really we need a new generation of leaders in Europe and in the US who are prepared to go back, forge a new alliance with Russia, because China is the real threat. We should be friends with Russia. And I really think that this too is what most of the Russian establishment ultimately want, because I don't think they really want to be going off on holiday or having their villas in China and Iran. They want to still be swanning around Europe and the US. And I think they think that if the Europe and the US is sufficiently weakened enough, they can promote these more pro-Russian extremist politicians who will want to forge a new pact with Russia. And we saw some inkling of that too in this supposed proposal from Donald Trump, in which his associates had told my colleagues at the Washington Post that were he to come to power, he would be able to broker an agreement with Russia in which Russia takes Donbass and Crimea and the rest of Ukraine continues to peacefully exist, and that's it, the war would be over, and yes, we'd all go back to being friends again. I think Russia would probably like that, at least for a while, until it decides that it'd gotten away with taking out a chunk of Ukraine, so it could probably take more, because our leaders in the West had proven so pliant and flexible that he could do so again and yet still have this stable order. But that's a lot of wishful thinking and a lot of ifs along the way. But look at what happened with the latest aid proposal. It was stalled for 6 months, and who knows whether that can happen again. Who knows at what point we reach another critical juncture where the West is suddenly like, we've got too many problems of our own. We can't afford to continue assisting Ukraine. Russia can get away with redrawing the global map.
Yeah, it strikes me that with a lot of this disinformation and everything that you've described, that Russia doesn't really have to work too hard right now. I mean, in the United States, you do have so much division and really a very emotional tone to everything. People are disturbed. They don't know where to go. There's a lot of belief that everybody lies and, well, maybe they're right. And it really, Russia, in a sense, doesn't have to come up with any new material. It can
Yeah.
quote what's going on in the United States or even in other countries and, in Europe, and just
Yes.
magnify that.
Yes, and indeed that is their main tactic. We saw that in one of the Kremlin documents, that political strategists were being instructed in the US to stay away from fake news. We want to stay as close to reality as possible. We want to tell people that this is what's really happening. This is not what the official media are not telling you. And their aim is, as Clint Watts put it, he said they reproduce 80% of what's true and then add their own 20% 90% of their own agenda to suit them. And that's what really works for them. But over time, in a strategic aggregate way, again, going back to this idea of in the digital media landscape, you are able over time to polarize, divide societies, because ideas that wouldn't have normally arisen in the mainstream media can flourish, fake news can flourish, so you undermine trust in institutions and so on. So it becomes a much easier landscape for Russia to manipulate. I mean, I remember being back in Moscow in the 90s, and the Russian officials were always frothing at the mouth at the likes of CNN and the BBC, because these were institutions that they couldn't penetrate and influence. But now the media landscape has been thrown open to them, and they can almost do whatever they want.
I want to ask you one last question, which is, this reminds me in a way of Putin's behavior domestically, where going back, talking about the 90s or the late 90s and early 2000s, where Putin would allow certain groups to gain some strength. They might be extremists on the right, especially. And then all of a sudden it becomes a threat. And then he's under threat. So he's playing with fire, and he has to put out that fire, almost like Prigozhin's rebellion, etc. I think in a broader sense, what do you think? Is this game, and I will use it as kind of a game, is this going to ultimately help, or could it hurt Putin himself, create instability in Russia itself?
Gosh, that's the trillion-dollar question. It's very difficult to know. I mean, there are so many different variables. I guess a lot hinges on what happens in your presidential election in November. Does Trump come to power and seek a new deal with Putin? In which case, Putin's standing could again be raised. But then there's a question. Not sure I see Putin now as surviving as a peacetime president. He almost needs confrontation with the West to bolster his own legitimacy, because what else does he have to offer his own people now after more than 20 years in power? And if there's no more fighting, people could start asking questions about the lives lost. So I think that's also a tricky question for Putin. But yeah, it's really difficult to say. I mean, on the other hand, though, I think he's eyeing further instability in the US, because no matter what the outcome of the election is, it's bound to be hotly contested. So does that provide him with a new inflection point for when assistance to Ukraine gets completely bogged down all over again in political infighting and lack of will in the US? So this will allow him to continue and again bolster his own reputation as this master tactician while the West crumbles around him. Unfortunately, I think perhaps that unless we're careful, then the latter outcome is more likely.
Wow. Well, Catherine Belton, this has really been a fascinating conversation. I'm glad we're back in touch, and congratulations on these articles. I think they're very, very important. I hope the West in general, and especially here in the U.S., will understand the significance of all of this. But thank you very much, and continue your great work.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on and for all the great questions.
Kennan X is a product of the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. It's the Wilson Center's oldest program, founded in 1974 by George F. Kennan, American statesman, James Billington, historian and former Librarian of Congress, and historian S. Frederick Starr. Inspired by them, the Kennan Institute's mission is to improve America's understanding of Russia and the wider region. Thanks for listening.